Margaret Chin sat in the back of the yellow taxi, her weathered hands smoothing down the fabric of her best navy blue dress. At 78 years old, she had lived through more than most people could imagine, but today felt different. Today, her grandson Michael was graduating from Marine Corps boot camp at Parris Island, and nothing in the world could have kept her away. The South Carolina heat pressed against the taxi windows as they drove through the gates of the military base. Margaret's heart raced with a mixture of pride and nervous excitement. She had traveled nearly 3,000 miles from her small apartment in San Francisco, using her entire monthly pension check to afford the plane ticket. The sacrifice meant eating nothing but instant noodles for the next month, but seeing Michael receive his Eagle, Globe, and Anchor was worth everything. "First time visiting Parris Island, ma'am?" the taxi driver asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Margaret nodded, her eyes taking in the perfectly manicured lawns and imposing buildings that stretched across the base. "My grandson is graduating today. He's been training here for 13 weeks. That's something to be proud of," the driver replied with genuine warmth. "Those kids go through hell to earn those dress blues." As they approached the ceremony venue, Margaret could see hundreds of families gathering outside the building. Parents, siblings, grandparents, and friends all dressed in their finest clothes, clutching programs and cameras. The excitement in the air was palpable, but Margaret felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. She paid the driver and stepped out onto the hot asphalt, immediately feeling overwhelmed by the crowd. At her age, large gatherings made her nervous, but she forced herself to walk toward the building entrance. She had come too far to let anxiety stop her now. Inside the auditorium, Margaret found a seat near the back. She preferred staying out of the spotlight, a habit she had developed over decades of keeping certain parts of her past hidden. The folding chair was uncomfortable, but she settled in and pulled out the program that had been handed to her at the door. "3rd Battalion, Company L," she whispered to herself, reading the company designation where Michael's name appeared in small print. Her eyes filled with tears as she realized how proud his late grandfather would have been. James would have loved to see this day. The ceremony began with the entrance of the Marine Corps Band, their crisp uniforms and synchronized movements immediately commanding the attention of everyone in the auditorium. Margaret felt goosebumps rise on her arms as the familiar strains of military music filled the space. The sound transported her back to another time, another place when she was young and the world was different. One by one, the companies of new Marines marched into the auditorium in perfect formation. Margaret strained her eyes, searching for Michael among the sea of identical dress blue uniforms. When she finally spotted him in the third row, her heart nearly burst with pride. He stood tall and confident, his shoulders back and his chin raised with the unmistakable bearing of a United States Marine. The commanding officer took the podium, a stern-looking man with ribbons covering the left side of his chest. Commander Robert Sullivan had been leading ceremonies like this for over 15 years, but he still felt moved by the transformation he witnessed in each new group of Marines. These young men and women had arrived at Parris Island as civilians and were leaving as warriors. "Ladies and gentlemen," Commander Sullivan began, his voice carrying easily throughout the packed auditorium. "Today we celebrate not just the completion of training, but the birth of new Marines. These men and women behind me have endured physical challenges, mental tests, and emotional trials that would break many people. They have earned their place among the few, the proud." Margaret listened intently to every word, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She thought about the phone call she had received from Michael during his brief moments of contact throughout the training. His voice had changed over those 13 weeks, becoming stronger and more confident with each conversation. The ceremony continued with the presentation of awards and recognitions. Margaret watched with interest as various Marines were called forward for exceptional performance during training. When Michael's name was called for academic excellence, she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out with joy. As the individual recognitions concluded, Commander Sullivan prepared for the final portion of the ceremony. This was always his favorite part, the moment when family members were invited to participate in the pinning of the eagle, globe, and anchor emblem on their new Marines. At this time, he announced, "We invite family members to come forward and help us welcome these new Marines into our brotherhood." The auditorium erupted into movement as hundreds of family members made their way toward the stage area. Margaret stood up slowly, her legs stiff from sitting, and began to walk toward where Michael was standing. The crowd was thick, and she found herself jostled by excited relatives pushing forward to reach their loved ones. She was still several rows back when she noticed that the families were being organized into lines for the pinning ceremony. Each new Marine was paired with their visiting family member for the symbolic moment. Margaret realized she would need to move closer to the front, despite her preference for staying in the background. As she made her way through the crowd, Margaret accidentally bumped into a man in uniform standing near the edge of the ceremony area. She looked up to apologize and found herself face to face with Commander Sullivan himself. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the noise of the crowd. "No problem at all, ma'am," he replied with a kind smile. "Are you here for one of our new Marines?" "Yes, my grandson, Michael Chun," she said, pointing toward where Michael was standing in formation. Commander Sullivan followed her gesture and nodded. "Private Chun performed exceptionally well during training. You should be very proud." Margaret felt her heart swell with pride at the commander's words. "I am, sir. Very proud." As she spoke, Margaret shifted her weight slightly, and the sleeve of her dress moved up her arm just enough to reveal the edge of something that made Commander Sullivan's expression change instantly. His smile faded, and his eyes focused intently on her arm. She had spent decades carefully hiding what Commander Sullivan had just glimpsed, and now she felt the familiar wave of fear and shame that always accompanied her when someone noticed. The tattoo on Margaret's arm was not decorative or fashionable. It was not something she had chosen in a moment of youthful rebellion or artistic expression. The numbers that were barely visible beneath her sleeve told a story that she had spent most of her life trying to forget, a story that connected her to one of the darkest chapters in human history. Commander Sullivan stared at her for a long moment, his mind processing what he thought he had seen. His military training had taught him to observe details, and his knowledge of history helped him understand the significance of what appeared to be tattooed numbers on this elderly woman's arm. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and something deeper, the complex mixture of shame and defiance that had shaped her entire adult life. She had worked so hard to build a normal life, to be known simply as Michael's grandmother, not as a survivor of something too terrible for most people to comprehend. "Ma'am," Commander Sullivan said quietly, his voice now filled with something that sounded like reverence. "Would you mind if I asked you about?" Margaret cut him off with a slight shake of her head. "Please, sir. Today is about Michael. I just want to see my grandson graduate." Commander Sullivan studied her face for a moment longer, seeing something in her eyes that confirmed his suspicions. This was not just any grandmother who had traveled to see her grandson's graduation. This was someone who had survived something unimaginable, someone who carried history in her very DNA. The noise of the ceremony continued around them, but Margaret felt as though she and the commander were standing in a bubble of silence. She could see the recognition in his eyes, and she knew that her carefully maintained privacy was about to be shattered. "Of course," Commander Sullivan said finally, "today is about the graduates." But even as he said the words, Margaret could see that his mind was racing. She had encountered this reaction before, though not often. Most people never noticed or understood the significance of the faded numbers on her arm. But occasionally, someone with knowledge of history would see them and recognize what they represented. Margaret had been 16 years old when she arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1944. She had been tattooed with the number 174517, a dehumanizing identifier that reduced her entire existence to a series of digits. For 2 years, she had survived conditions designed to break both body and spirit watching friends and family members disappear into the darkness of the Nazi killing machine. When the camp was liberated in 1945, Margaret was one of the fortunate few who lived to see freedom. But surviving the physical horror was only the beginning of her journey. She had spent the next 7 decades building a new life, learning to trust again, finding love, raising a family, and trying to contribute something positive to a world that had shown her its worst face. She had met James Chun in San Francisco in 1952, a Chinese-American veteran who had fought in the Pacific during World War II. He had his own demons from the war, and perhaps that shared understanding of trauma had drawn them together. They had married and raised 3 children, building a quiet, stable life far from the chaos of their war-torn youth. James had known about Margaret's past, of course. She could never have hidden something so fundamental from the man she loved. But they had rarely spoken about it in detail. James understood that some wounds needed to remain covered in order to heal, and he had given her the gift of a future that was not defined by her past. Their son David had grown up knowing only that his mother had lived through difficult times in Europe before coming to America. It was not until he was an adult that Margaret had shared more complete details about her experiences, and even then, she had focused on survival and hope rather than the worst of what she had endured. Now, as she stood facing Commander Sullivan's penetrating gaze, Margaret felt the weight of all those years of careful privacy. She had told herself that she kept her past hidden not out of shame, but out of a desire to protect others from the darkness of her memories. But in her heart, she knew that there was shame there too, the irrational but persistent feeling that somehow she should have been able to prevent what had happened to her family. "Grandmother!" Michael's voice cut through her thoughts as he appeared beside them, his face beaming with excitement. "You made it! I can't believe you actually came all this way." Margaret felt relief wash over her as she turned her attention to her grandson. This was why she was here. This was what mattered. She reached up and straightened his collar, marveling at how handsome he looked in his dress blues. "I wouldn't have missed it for anything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You look so grown up, so strong." Michael grinned and turned to acknowledge Commander Sullivan. "Sir, this is my grandmother, Margaret Chun. She flew in from San Francisco just to be here today." Commander Sullivan extended his hand to Margaret, and she noticed that he was studying her face with a new intensity. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Chun. Your grandson has been one of our most dedicated recruits." Margaret shook his hand, feeling the strength in his grip and seeing something in his eyes that looked almost like awe. She found it unsettling to be the object of such intense attention, especially when she was trying to focus on Michael's achievement. "Can we do the pinning ceremony now?" Michael asked eagerly. "I want to get some pictures with grandmother before she has to catch her flight back." Commander Sullivan nodded, but Margaret could feel his continued scrutiny as they moved toward the designated area for the ceremony. She tried to focus on Michael, on this moment that meant everything to both of them, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed in the last few minutes. The pinning ceremony itself was simple, but deeply meaningful. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she helped attach the eagle, globe, and anchor pin to Michael's uniform, the symbol that would identify him as a United States Marine for the rest of his life. As she fumbled with the small clasp, her sleeve shifted again, and she saw Commander Sullivan's eyes immediately focus on her arm. "There," she said, stepping back to admire her grandson in his complete uniform. "Now you're officially a Marine." Michael stood at attention for a moment, then broke into a grin and hugged his grandmother tightly. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she held him, thinking about all the years of struggle and sacrifice that had led to this moment of pure joy. Around them, other families were completing their own pinning ceremonies, and the auditorium was filled with the sounds of celebration. Camera flashes lit up the space as parents and grandparents captured these precious moments with their new Marines. Commander Sullivan approached them again as they finished taking photos. "Mrs. Chun, if I might have a word with you privately?" Margaret felt her heart sink. She had hoped to get through the day without having to confront whatever the commander had observed about her past. But she could see in his expression that he was not going to let the matter drop. "Michael," she said, "why don't you go find some of your friends? I'll just speak with the commander for a moment." Michael looked confused, but nodded and walked away toward a group of his fellow graduates who were celebrating nearby. Margaret watched him go, wishing she could just focus on his happiness rather than dealing with unwanted questions about her past. Commander Sullivan led her to a quieter corner of the auditorium, away from the main crowd of celebrating families. Margaret braced herself for the inevitable questions, the uncomfortable conversation that would force her to relive memories she had spent decades trying to bury. "Mrs. Chun," he began, his voice low and respectful, "I want you to know that what I think I observed is safe with me. But I also want you to know that if what I suspect is true, then your presence here today represents something incredibly significant." Margaret looked up at him, trying to read his intentions. She had encountered many different reactions over the years when people learned about her past. Some people became uncomfortable and tried to change the subject. Others bombarded her with questions that felt more like curiosity than genuine interest in her experience. A few had even questioned the truth of what she had lived through. But in Commander Sullivan's face, she saw something different. There was respect there, and something that looked almost like reverence. It made her feel uncomfortable in a different way, as though he was placing her on a pedestal where she didn't belong. "Commander," she said quietly, "I came here today as Michael's grandmother. That's all I want to be." He nodded slowly, understanding her reluctance to discuss what he had observed. "I respect that completely. But, Mrs. Chun, in my position, I have the privilege of meeting many heroes. And if I'm right about what I think I saw, then you are someone whose very presence here honors every Marine in this building." Margaret felt overwhelmed by his words. She had never thought of herself as a hero. Survivors were not heroes, she believed. They were simply people who had been lucky enough to endure when others had not. The real heroes were the people who had fought to liberate the camps. People like her late husband who had served in the military to protect freedom and democracy. "I'm just an old woman who wanted to see her grandson graduate," she insisted. Commander Sullivan studied her for a long moment, and Margaret could see that he was struggling with something. Finally, he spoke again, his voice even quieter than before. "Mrs. Chun, my grandfather was with the 82nd Airborne when they liberated some of the camps in Germany. He used to tell me stories about the people they found there, about the survivors who had somehow managed to hold on to their humanity despite everything they had been through. He said they were the bravest people he ever met." Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. She had not expected this personal connection, this bridge between her past and the present moment. It made the conversation feel more intimate and more dangerous at the same time. "Your grandfather sounds like he was a good man," she said simply. "He was. And he taught me that some people carry history with them in ways that the rest of us can barely comprehend. If you are who I think you are, then your being here today, celebrating your grandson's achievement, represent a victory that goes far beyond anything we could measure." Margaret felt tears beginning to form in her eyes again, but these were different tears than the ones she had shed during Michael's ceremony. These were tears that came from a place she had kept locked away for decades, a place where grief and loss lived alongside gratitude and hope. She had survived not just to see this day, but to see her family continue and grow strong. Michael's graduation represented the continuation of a family line that the Nazis had tried to eliminate. Every moment of his success was a refutation of the ideology that had sought to destroy people like her. "I need to get back to Michael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Commander Sullivan nodded and stepped aside to let her pass. But as she walked away, Margaret could feel that something had shifted in the atmosphere of the day. The secret she had carried for so long had been glimpsed by someone who understood its significance, and there was no way to put that knowledge back into hiding. Margaret rejoined Michael and his group of newly graduated Marines, trying to push the uncomfortable conversation with Commander Sullivan out of her mind. The young men and women around her grandson were glowing with pride and excitement, their faces bright with the satisfaction of having completed one of the most challenging training programs in the world. "Grandmother, I want you to meet my best friend from boot camp," Michael said, pulling her toward a tall young man with kind eyes. "This is Marcus Williams from Alabama." "Marcus, this is my grandmother I've been telling you about." Marcus snapped to attention and extended his hand with a respectful nod. "Ma'am, it's an honor to meet you. Michael talked about you every day. He said you helped raise him after his dad died." Margaret shook Marcus's hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of 13 weeks of hard physical training. "Michael has told me wonderful things about you too, Marcus. He said you helped him get through some of the difficult times." "We helped each other, ma'am. That's what Marines do." Margaret smiled at the pride in the young man's voice. She could see the bond that had formed between these recruits, forged through shared hardship and mutual support. It reminded her of relationships she had formed during her own time of trial, connections that had been essential to survival. As they talked, Margaret noticed that other family members were beginning to gather around them. Parents and siblings eager to meet the friends their loved ones had made during training. The atmosphere was festive and warm, filled with the joy of reunion and accomplishment. "Mrs. Chun," a voice behind her said. Margaret turned to see a middle-aged woman with tears in her eyes. "I'm Marcus's mother, Jennifer Williams. Marcus has told us so much about Michael, and about how proud Michael is of his grandmother who sacrificed to be here today." Margaret felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. "Oh, it wasn't really a sacrifice. I couldn't miss such an important day. Flying across the country at your age is definitely a sacrifice," Jennifer insisted. "Marcus told us you live on a fixed income and save for months to afford the trip. That kind of love and dedication is inspiring." Margaret realized that Michael had been sharing details about her financial situation with his friends, probably without realizing how personal that information was. She felt a mixture of pride that he spoke of her with such love and embarrassment that strangers knew about her limited means. "Family is worth any sacrifice," she said simply. As they continued talking, Margaret noticed that Commander Sullivan was making his way through the crowd, stopping to speak with various families. She watched him from the corner of her eye, hoping he would continue past their group without stopping. But she could see that he was moving deliberately in their direction. Michael was in the middle of telling a funny story about their first week of training when Commander Sullivan approached their small gathering. The young Marines immediately snapped to attention, their conversations stopping mid-sentence. "At ease," Commander Sullivan said with a smile. "This is a celebration, not an inspection." The Marines relaxed but maintained their respectful posture. Margaret felt her stomach tighten as the commander's eyes met hers briefly before he turned his attention to the group as a whole. "I wanted to personally congratulate this group," he said. "You've all shown exceptional dedication during training, and your drill instructors have nothing but positive things to say about your performance as a team." Michael beamed with pride. "Thank you, sir. We couldn't have made it through without each other." "That's exactly the kind of attitude that makes a successful Marine," Commander Sullivan replied. Then he turned slightly toward Margaret. "And, Mrs. Chun, I hope you're proud of what your grandson has accomplished here." "Very proud, sir," Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Michael told us during training about the sacrifices you made to help raise him after his father passed away. It's clear that the values you taught him helped prepare him for the challenges of becoming a Marine." Margaret felt uncomfortable with the attention being focused on her, especially with Commander Sullivan's penetrating gaze. She could sense that he was leading toward something, building up to a point that would make her even more uncomfortable. "I just did what any grandmother would do," she said quietly. "Not every grandmother would have the strength to help a young man develop the kind of character we see in Michael," Commander Sullivan continued. "It takes someone who understands adversity, who has faced challenges themselves, to teach that kind of resilience." Margaret felt her heart begin to race. She could hear the subtext in his words, the way he was alluding to her past without directly stating what he suspected. She glanced around at the faces surrounding them, hoping no one else could detect the undercurrent of their conversation. Michael looked confused by the serious turn the conversation had taken. "Sir, my grandmother has always been strong. She worked 2 jobs to help support our family after Dad died, even though she was already past retirement age. That kind of dedication speaks to someone who understands the value of perseverance," Commander Sullivan said, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "Someone who has learned that survival sometimes requires extraordinary strength." Margaret felt as though the walls of the auditorium were closing in around her. The word survival felt loaded with meaning, and she was certain now that Commander Sullivan was deliberately probing to see how she would respond to his hints about her past. "If you'll excuse me," Margaret said, stepping back slightly, "I should probably find the restroom before we leave for lunch." "Of course," Commander Sullivan said. "But, Mrs. Chun, before you go, I wanted to mention that we have a special recognition ceremony next month for family members who have made exceptional sacrifices to support our Marines. I think your story would be very inspiring to our community." Margaret felt panic rising in her chest. The last thing she wanted was to be featured in any kind of special ceremony that would draw attention to her background. She had spent decades avoiding exactly this kind of situation. "That's very kind, sir, but I'm not really comfortable with public recognition," she said, hoping her tone conveyed finality. Michael looked disappointed. "Grandmother, you should consider it. What you've done for our family is pretty amazing." "Your grandmother's humility is admirable," Commander Sullivan said. "But sometimes it's important to share stories of resilience and strength. They can inspire others who are facing their own challenges." Margaret could see that Commander Sullivan was not going to let this go easily. She recognized the look in his eyes, the same expression she had seen on the faces of Holocaust museum curators, documentary filmmakers, and historians over the years. People who wanted to preserve her story, to use her experience to educate others about the importance of never forgetting. She understood their motivations and even respected them, but she had made a conscious choice long ago to live her life looking forward rather than backward. She had shared her story when she felt it was necessary, but she had never wanted to become a professional survivor, someone whose identity was defined entirely by the worst thing that had ever happened to her. "I appreciate the invitation, sir," she said firmly, "but I prefer to keep my private life private." Commander Sullivan nodded, but Margaret could see disappointment in his expression. "I understand, but if you ever change your mind, please know that you would be welcome here anytime." Margaret excused herself and made her way toward the restroom, needing a few moments alone to collect herself. The encounter with Commander Sullivan had left her feeling emotionally drained and anxious about what might happen if he decided to pursue the matter further. In the privacy of the restroom, Margaret looked at herself in the mirror. She saw an elderly woman with silver hair and wrinkled skin, someone who looked like any other grandmother at any other family celebration. But she also knew that beneath her carefully maintained exterior lay experiences that most people could not imagine. She had been born Margot Weiss in Prague in 1928, the daughter of a university professor and a talented pianist. Her childhood had been comfortable and cultured until the Nazi occupation changed everything. By 1942, her family had been forced into the Theresienstadt ghetto, and by 1944, they were on trains bound for Auschwitz-Birkenau. Margaret had been separated from her parents at the selection ramp and never saw them again. She had survived the camp through a combination of luck, determination, and the kindness of other prisoners who had shared their meager rations and taught her strategies for avoiding the attention of guards. When liberation came in January 1945, Margaret was one of only 7,000 prisoners still alive in the camp. She weighed less than 80 pounds and was suffering from typhus, but she was breathing. In the chaos of post-war Europe, she had eventually made her way to a displaced persons camp in Germany, where she spent 3 years learning English and waiting for permission to emigrate to America. She had chosen the name Margaret Shun when she married James in 1952, partly to honor her new life and partly to distance herself from the identity that had nearly been destroyed in the camps. For 30 years of marriage, she had been simply Margaret Chun, wife and mother, someone whose most pressing concerns were managing the household budget and helping her children with their homework. It was only after James died in 1982 that Margaret had begun to speak more openly about her past. The emergence of Holocaust denial in the 1980s had motivated her to provide testimony to the USC Shoah Foundation, and she had occasionally spoken to high school classes about the importance of tolerance and human rights. But she had always been selective about when and how she shared her story. She refused to be defined by her victimization, insisting that her survival was only meaningful if it led to a life of purpose and joy. She had built that life through decades of quiet determination, and she was not willing to sacrifice her privacy now, even for well-intentioned educational purposes. Margaret returned to the celebration feeling more composed, but still wary of further interaction with Commander Sullivan. She found Michael and his friends gathered around a table in the reception area, sharing stories and exchanging contact information. "There you are, grandmother," Michael said, jumping up to offer her his chair. "We were just talking about our plans after we finish our advanced training. Marcus is going to be stationed in California, so maybe you can meet his family when they visit." Margaret settled into the chair gratefully, feeling the exhaustion that came with high emotion and the stress of travel. "That would be lovely," she said, though she hoped the conversation would stay focused on the young people's futures rather than her own past. Jennifer Williams leaned forward with interest. "Mrs. Chun, do you have other grandchildren? Michael talks about you so much, but I don't think he's mentioned cousins." "Michael is my only grandchild," Margaret replied. "My son David is his father, but David was my only child." "That makes your relationship even more special then," Jennifer said warmly. "It must have been difficult for both of you when Michael's father died." Margaret nodded, thinking about the challenges she and Michael had faced together during his teenage years. David had been killed in a car accident when Michael was 15, leaving the boy angry and directionless. Margaret had stepped in to help her daughter-in-law Lisa provide guidance and stability, but it had been a difficult period for the entire family. "Michael helped me as much as I helped him," she said honestly. "Sometimes we need each other in ways we don't expect." As they talked, Margaret noticed that Commander Sullivan had moved on to speak with other families, but she could feel him glancing in their direction periodically. She tried to focus on the conversations around her, but part of her mind remained alert to his presence and concerned about what he might do with his suspicions about her identity. The reception continued for another hour, with families taking photos and making plans to stay in touch. Margaret found herself genuinely enjoying the company of the other parents and grandparents, people who shared her pride in watching their loved ones achieve something significant. When it was finally time to leave for lunch, Michael walked Margaret toward the exit, his arm linked through hers. "I'm so glad you came, grandmother. This whole experience means so much more because you're here to share it with me." "I wouldn't have missed it for anything," Margaret replied, squeezing his arm affectionately. "I'm so proud of the man you've become." As they reached the door, Commander Sullivan appeared beside them one more time. "Mrs. Chun, it's been an honor meeting you today. I hope you have a safe flight back to San Francisco." "Thank you, Commander," Margaret replied politely. He handed her a business card. "If you ever decide you'd like to share your experiences with our Marines, please don't hesitate to contact me. I believe your perspective would be valuable to young people who are learning about service and sacrifice." Margaret took the card reluctantly, knowing she had no intention of using it, but not wanting to be rude in front of Michael. "Thank you for your kindness to my grandson." As they walked away from the building, Michael asked, "What was that about, grandmother? It seemed like the commander was really interested in talking to you." Margaret slipped the business card into her purse and tried to sound casual. "Oh, I think he was just being polite to families. You know how military people are about showing respect to elders." Michael seemed to accept this explanation, but Margaret could see that he was curious about the unusual level of attention she had received from the commander. She hoped his curiosity would fade as they moved on to their lunch celebration. They had reservations at a restaurant near the base, a family-style place that specialized in Southern comfort food. Margaret was looking forward to a quiet meal with Michael, a chance to hear more about his training experience without the formal atmosphere of the ceremony. But as they settled into their booth and began looking at menus, Margaret realized that her encounter with Commander Sullivan had changed something fundamental about the day. She could no longer simply enjoy her role as a proud grandmother celebrating her grandson's achievement. Instead, she found herself constantly thinking about the past she had tried so hard to leave behind, wondering if her carefully constructed privacy was beginning to unravel. The weight of her history felt heavier than it had in years, and she wondered if coming to Paris Island had been a mistake. She had wanted to give Michael this gift of her presence at his graduation, but she was beginning to fear that the cost might be higher than she had anticipated. The restaurant was bustling with other military families celebrating their graduates, the atmosphere warm and festive despite Margaret's internal turmoil. She and Michael had been seated at a corner booth with a view of the parking lot, where she could see families posing for more photos next to their cars, still basking in the glow of the morning ceremony. "Tell me about the hardest part of training," Margaret said, hoping to focus their conversation on Michael's experiences rather than her own lingering anxiety about Commander Sullivan's attention. Michael's face grew serious as he considered her question. "Honestly, grandmother, it wasn't the physical stuff that was hardest. I mean, the obstacle courses and the long marches were tough, but I expected that. The hardest part was learning to depend on other people and having them depend on me." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "That's a very grown-up realization. Yeah, I guess I always thought being strong meant handling everything by myself. But our drill instructors taught us that real strength comes from being part of something bigger than yourself. Like when Marcus was struggling with his marksmanship scores, I could have just focused on my own performance. But helping him succeed made both of us better Marines." Margaret felt a deep warmth spreading through her chest as she listened to her grandson talk about teamwork and mutual support. These were lessons she had learned under very different circumstances, but the underlying truth was the same. Survival often depended on the willingness to help others and accept help in return. "Your grandfather, James, would have loved hearing you talk like that," she said. "He believed that the best way to honor your own strength was to use it to help others become strong too." Michael smiled at the mention of his grandfather. Although James had died when Michael was only 12, the boy had absorbed many of his values through stories and the example of his life. "I wish he could have seen today. I think he would have understood what it meant to become a Marine." "Oh, he definitely would have," Margaret agreed. "He used to say that the military taught him that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing what needed to be done even when you were terrified." As they talked, Margaret found herself relaxing for the first time since her encounter with Commander Sullivan. This was exactly what she had hoped for when she planned her trip. Quality time with Michael, a chance to hear his thoughts, and share in his pride. The food arrived, and they settled into comfortable conversation about his upcoming advanced training and his long-term goals in the Marines. But their peaceful lunch was interrupted when Margaret noticed a familiar figure entering the restaurant. Commander Sullivan was walking through the dining room with another officer, apparently looking for a table. Margaret felt her stomach clench with anxiety as she realized he would likely notice them. "Michael," she said quietly, "I think I see your commander over there." Michael turned to look and immediately brightened. "Oh, cool. Maybe I can introduce you properly this time. He's really a great leader, grandmother. All the recruits respect him." Before Margaret could object, Michael was waving toward Commander Sullivan's table. The commander noticed the gesture and headed in their direction, his companion following behind. "Private Chun," Commander Sullivan said as he approached their booth. "I hope you're enjoying your celebration lunch." "Yes, sir," Michael replied, standing briefly out of respect. "Commander, I'd like you to meet my grandmother again, but properly this time. Margaret Chun, this is Commander Robert Sullivan, the best commanding officer in the Marine Corps." Margaret forced a smile as she shook hands with the commander again. "It's nice to see you again, Commander." "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Chun. I'd like you to meet Colonel Patricia Hendricks, our base historian. Margaret felt her heart skip a beat as she shook hands with the colonel, a woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes and a firm handshake. The introduction of a base historian felt ominous, as though Commander Sullivan was assembling pieces for some larger purpose. "Mrs. Chun, it's wonderful to meet you," Colonel Hendricks said warmly. "Commander Sullivan was just telling me about your family's dedication to supporting Michael through his training. It's always inspiring to hear about the sacrifices military families make." Margaret tried to read the subtext in the colonel's words, wondering how much Commander Sullivan had shared with her about his suspicions. "Michael makes it easy to be supportive. We're very proud of his accomplishments." "As you should be," Colonel Hendricks replied. "We see many young people come through our training program, but the ones who succeed usually have strong family foundations. Character and resilience are often learned at home long before recruits arrive here." The conversation felt like it was moving in a direction that made Margaret increasingly uncomfortable, but she couldn't find a polite way to redirect it without seeming rude in front of Michael. "Would you mind if we joined you for a few minutes?" Commander Sullivan asked. "We'd love to hear more about your family story." Margaret wanted to refuse, but she could see the excitement in Michael's face at the prospect of spending more time with his commanding officers. She felt trapped between her desire to protect her privacy and her reluctance to disappoint her grandson on his special day. "Of course," she said reluctantly, scooting over to make room in the booth. As the officers settled in, Margaret noticed that Colonel Hendricks was studying her with the same intense attention that Commander Sullivan had shown earlier. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, and the feeling was deeply unsettling. "Mrs. Chun," Colonel Hendricks began, "Commander Sullivan mentioned that you've lived through some challenging times that helped prepare you to support Michael through difficulties. We're always interested in hearing about the experiences that shape strong military families." Margaret felt her mouth go dry. She could see now that this encounter was no coincidence. Commander Sullivan had clearly shared his suspicions with Colonel Hendricks, and they were working together to try to draw her out about her past. "I think every family faces challenges," she said carefully. "The important thing is learning from them and moving forward." "Absolutely," Colonel Hendricks agreed, "though some challenges are certainly more significant than others. I specialize in military history, particularly World War II and its aftermath. I've spent a lot of time studying the experiences of people who lived through that period." The comment felt like a fishing expedition, an attempt to get Margaret to reveal something about her connection to that era. Margaret felt her anxiety rising as she realized that these officers were not going to let the subject drop easily. Michael looked confused by the direction of the conversation. "World War II? Grandmother, I never knew you had any connection to the war. You never really talked about that time period." Margaret felt panic beginning to set in. She had worked so hard to keep her past separate from her family life, sharing only selective details when absolutely necessary. The idea of having her history exposed in front of Michael in a public restaurant felt like a violation of everything she had worked to protect. "There's not much to say about it," she said, her voice becoming more strained. "It was a long time ago, and I prefer to focus on the present." Commander Sullivan and Colonel Hendricks exchanged a meaningful glance that did not go unnoticed by Margaret. She could see that they were communicating something to each other, probably planning their next approach. "Of course," Commander Sullivan said diplomatically, "though sometimes understanding the past can help us appreciate the present even more. The sacrifices that previous generations made often shape the opportunities that current generations enjoy." Margaret felt like she was being slowly cornered, and her instinct was to flee. But she was trapped in the booth with no graceful way to escape, and she could see that Michael was becoming more curious about the conversation with each passing moment. "Grandmother," Michael said slowly, "is there something about your past that I don't know? These officers seem to think you have an interesting story." Margaret looked into her grandson's earnest face and felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Part of her had always known that someday she might need to share more of her history with him, but She had wanted that conversation to happen on her terms, in private, when she felt ready to handle his questions and reactions. Everyone has stories from their past. Michael, she said evasively. Some stories are easier to tell than others. Colonel Hendricks leaned forward slightly, her expression gentle but persistent. Mrs. Chun, if you're who I think you are, then your presence here today represents something truly remarkable. You've survived to see your grandson achieve something wonderful, and that's a victory that extends far beyond your personal family. Margaret felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, partly from anxiety and partly from the emotional weight of having her carefully maintained privacy invaded. She had spent decades building a life where she was known for who she was in the present, not for what she had endured in the past. I don't know what you think you know about me, she said quietly, but I came here today as Michael's grandmother. That's the only identity that matters to me right now. Michael reached across the table and took her hand, clearly sensing her distress even if he didn't understand its source. Grandmother, it's okay. Whatever they're talking about, you don't have to discuss anything you don't want to. Margaret felt grateful for her grandson's protective instinct, but she could see that the officers were not deterred by her reluctance to engage with their questions. They seemed to believe they were on the verge of confirming something important, and their persistence was becoming more uncomfortable with each exchange. Mrs. Chun, Commander Sullivan said, his voice taking on a more formal tone, I want to be direct with you about why this conversation matters to us. Earlier today, I noticed what appeared to be numbers tattooed on your arm. Combined with your age and some other details, I believe you may be a Holocaust survivor. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, impossible to ignore or deflect. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as her worst fear was realized. Her past had been exposed in exactly the way she had spent decades trying to prevent. Michael's grip on her hand tightened as his eyes widened with shock. Grandmother, is that true? You're a Holocaust survivor. Margaret looked at her grandson's face and saw a mixture of surprise, confusion, and something that might have been awe. She had wanted to protect him from the darkness of her past, but now the protection had been stripped away by well-meaning strangers who thought they understood what was best for her story. Yes, she whispered, the word feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Yes, I am. The admission seemed to change the entire atmosphere of the restaurant booth. Colonel Hendricks leaned back with obvious satisfaction, as though she had just solved a puzzle she had been working on. Commander Sullivan nodded with what appeared to be vindication, his suspicions confirmed. But it was Michael's reaction that concerned Margaret most. Her grandson was staring at her with an expression she had never seen before, as though he was seeing her for the first time. She worried that learning about her past would change their relationship, would make him see her as a victim rather than simply his grandmother. I can't believe you never told me, Michael said, his voice filled with emotion. All these years, and you never said anything about going through something like that. Margaret felt defensive about her choice to keep her history private, even as she understood his shock. I wanted you to know me as I am now, not as someone defined by the worst thing that ever happened to her. But, grandmother, this changes everything. I mean, it doesn't change how I feel about you, but it changes how I understand your strength. Everything you've been through, everything you've overcome, it's incredible. Margaret could see that Michael was processing this new information through the lens of his recent military training, understanding her survival in terms of the courage and resilience that the Marines had taught him to value. Part of her was proud that he was responding with admiration rather than pity, but she still felt violated by the way her privacy had been breached. Mrs. Chun, Colonel Hendricks said, I hope you understand that we're not trying to intrude on your privacy out of mere curiosity. Your story represents something that's increasingly rare and precious, living testimony to one of the most important periods in human history. My story belongs to me, Margaret replied with more firmness than she had shown all day. I get to decide when and how it's shared. Commander Sullivan looked chastened by her response. You're absolutely right, and I apologize if our approach has been insensitive. But I hope you'll consider the impact your presence here could have on our Marines. Young people today often learn about the Holocaust in abstract terms through textbooks and documentaries. Meeting someone who actually lived through it and went on to build a beautiful life, that's powerful education. Margaret felt torn between her desire to maintain her privacy and her recognition that education about the Holocaust was important work. She had always believed that people needed to understand what had happened so that it could never happen again. But she had never wanted to become a professional educator about her trauma. "I understand your intentions," she said slowly, "but I need time to think about this. Today was supposed to be about Michael's achievement, not about my past." Michael squeezed her hand again. "Grandmother, whatever you decide is okay with me. I'm just honored to be your grandson, whether you share your story with others or not." Margaret felt a rush of love for her grandson and gratitude for his unconditional support. Even in his shock at learning about her past, his primary concern was for her comfort and autonomy. It reminded her why she had made all those sacrifices to help raise him. He had grown into exactly the kind of man she had hoped he would become. Colonel Hendricks pulled a business card from her pocket and placed it on the table in front of Margaret. "Mrs. Chun, I'm going to leave my contact information with you. If you ever decide you'd like to talk about your experiences, or if you'd like to visit our base museum where we have exhibits about World War II, please don't hesitate to reach out." Margaret took the card, knowing that accepting it was not a commitment to anything beyond politeness. But she could see that both officers were hopeful that she would eventually decide to engage with their educational mission. "Thank you," she said simply. As the officers prepared to leave their table, Commander Sullivan turned back to Margaret one more time. "Mrs. Chun, I want you to know that your grandson is lucky to have you. The strength and resilience you've shown throughout your life clearly helped shape the outstanding Marine he's become." After they left, Margaret and Michael sat in silence for several minutes, both processing what had just happened. Margaret felt emotionally drained and worried about how this revelation would affect their relationship going forward. "Are you angry with me for not telling you?" she asked finally. Michael considered the question carefully before responding. "I'm not angry. Maybe a little hurt that you felt like you couldn't trust me with something so important. But I think I understand why you kept it private. I wanted to protect you from carrying the weight of my memories," Margaret explained. "I wanted your childhood to be about hope and possibility, not about the darkness that some humans are capable of. But, grandmother, knowing about your past doesn't make me see darkness. It makes me see incredible strength. You survived something that killed millions of people, and then you built a life full of love and purpose. That's not darkness. That's light triumphing over darkness." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she heard her grandson's words. Maybe she had been wrong to assume that sharing her story would burden him. Maybe he was strong enough to handle the truth and wise enough to understand what it meant about the resilience of the human spirit. "I love you, Michael," she said through her tears. "I love you too, grandmother. And I'm proud of you for surviving so that you could be here today." As they finished their lunch and prepared to leave the restaurant, Margaret realized that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with her past. For the first time in decades, her survival story had been revealed not as a burden to be hidden, but as a testament to strength that had contributed to her family's success. She still wasn't sure what she would do about the request to share her story publicly, but she was beginning to think that maybe her past didn't have to be a source of shame or something to be carefully hidden. Maybe it could be something else entirely, a gift that she could choose to share when and how she felt ready. 6 months after Michael's graduation, Margaret sat in her small San Francisco apartment, staring at the 2 business cards that had remained on her kitchen table since her return from Paris Island. Colonel Hendricks and Commander Sullivan had each called twice, leaving polite messages inviting her to consider speaking to Marines about her experiences. Each time, Margaret had deleted the messages without calling back. But something had been changing in her thinking during those months. Her relationship with Michael had deepened since he learned about her past, and their weekly phone calls now included conversations about history, resilience, and the importance of remembering difficult truths. Michael was stationed at Camp Pendleton, not far from San Francisco, and when he visited every few weeks, their conversations often turned to the lessons that could be drawn from her survival. "Grandmother," Michael had said during his most recent visit, "some of the Marines in my unit have been asking me about your story. Word has gotten around that my grandmother is a Holocaust survivor, and they're genuinely curious about what that means." Margaret had been surprised by the interest. What do they want to know? They want to understand how someone survives something like that, and then goes on to build a normal, happy life. A lot of these guys come from difficult backgrounds themselves, and they're trying to figure out how to move forward from their own traumas. Margaret had been struck by the idea that her story might offer hope to young people dealing with their own challenges. She had always thought of her survival as something personal, but perhaps there were lessons in it that could help others navigate their own difficulties. Now, as she held the business cards, Margaret was trying to decide whether she was ready to take the step of sharing her story more widely. The thought still made her nervous, but she was beginning to see it less as an invasion of her privacy and more as a choice she could make about how to use her experiences. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Michael, calling from Camp Pendleton. "Hi, grandmother. How are you feeling today?" "I'm fine, dear. Just thinking about some things." "The business cards are still sitting on your table, aren't they?" Margaret smiled at how well he knew her. "Yes, they are. Have you thought any more about what Colonel Hendricks suggested? About visiting the museum first, just to see what kind of educational work they do?" Margaret had been considering this suggestion. Colonel Hendricks had mentioned that the base museum had exhibits about World War II, and that she could visit privately before making any decisions about speaking publicly. It seemed like a way to dip her toe in the water without committing to anything larger. "I've been thinking about it," Margaret admitted. "What's holding you back?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, trying to articulate the complex mixture of fears and hopes that were battling in her mind. "I suppose I'm afraid that once I start talking about it publicly, I won't be able to control how the story gets used. I've seen Holocaust survivors become symbols rather than real people, and I don't want to lose my own identity in that process." Michael was quiet on the other end of the line, and Margaret could almost hear him processing her concerns. "What if you started small? What if you just talked to Colonel Hendricks privately first, told her your story the way you want to tell it, and then decided later whether you wanted to share it with anyone else?" Margaret felt something shift in her chest as she considered the suggestion. The idea of having some control over the process, of being able to set boundaries and maintain her autonomy, made the prospect less frightening. "That's not a terrible idea," she said slowly. "And, grandmother, I could come with you if you want. I have some leave time saved up, and I think it would be meaningful for me to hear your complete story too." Margaret felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. The offer of Michael's support touched her deeply, and the idea of having him there as she revisited her past felt both comforting and appropriate. He had become the inheritor of her survival, the proof that her endurance had been worthwhile. "I think I'd like that very much," she said. 3 weeks later, Margaret found herself driving through the gates of Paris Island again, this time in a rental car with Michael beside her. The base looked exactly the same as it had during graduation, but Margaret felt different. She was no longer trying to hide her past, but was instead preparing to engage with it consciously and deliberately. Colonel Hendricks met them at the museum entrance, greeting Margaret with warmth, but not the overwhelming enthusiasm that Margaret had feared. The colonel seemed to understand the delicate nature of what Margaret was considering and was careful to maintain a respectful, low-pressure approach. "Mrs. Chun, thank you so much for coming. I know this isn't easy, and I want you to know that everything we discussed today will remain private unless you decide otherwise." Margaret appreciated the reassurance. "Thank you, Colonel. I'm still not sure what I'm comfortable sharing, but I thought it was time to at least explore the possibility." They began with a tour of the museum's World War II exhibits, which Margaret found to be thoughtfully curated and historically accurate. The displays covered the war from multiple perspectives including the experiences of American service members, civilians in occupied territories, and Holocaust survivors. When they reached the Holocaust section, Margaret stopped in front of a display case containing artifacts from liberated concentration camps. Among the items was a pair of shoes that looked remarkably similar to the ones she had worn during her time at Auschwitz-Birkenau. These displays are meant to help young Marines understand what they're defending when they take their oath to protect freedom and democracy, Colonel Hendricks explained quietly. Many of them have never been exposed to this history in any meaningful way. Margaret stared at the shoes for a long moment, remembering the feel of wooden clogs on her feet during the long roll calls in the camp. It's important for them to understand, she said finally. Freedom isn't free, and democracy isn't guaranteed. Every generation has to choose to protect these values. Michael stood beside her, his expression serious as he absorbed the weight of what his grandmother had lived through. Grandmother, how did you keep hope alive during the worst times? Margaret considered the question carefully. It was one she had asked herself many times over the decades, trying to understand how she had managed to survive when so many others had not. I think hope was the wrong word for what I felt, she said slowly. Hope implies believing that things will get better, and there were long periods when I couldn't imagine that. What I had was more like determination, a stubborn refusal to let the people who wanted to destroy me have that victory. Colonel Hendricks was listening intently, and Margaret could see that she was mentally recording every word. That's a powerful distinction. Determination versus hope. Yes, hope can be taken away by circumstances, but determination comes from inside. It's a choice you make about how you're going to respond to whatever happens to you. As they continued through the museum, Margaret found herself sharing more details about her experiences than she had intended. Something about the setting, combined with Michael's presence and Colonel Hendricks' respectful questions, made her feel safe enough to open up in ways she rarely allowed herself. She talked about the importance of small acts of kindness among the prisoners, how sharing a piece of bread could mean the difference between survival and death. She described the mental strategies she had used to maintain her sense of self when everything was designed to strip away her humanity. She explained how the decision to survive was something she had to make fresh each day, not a one-time choice. Michael asked questions that showed he was beginning to understand the complexity of survival and recovery. How did you learn to trust people again after liberation? How did you know that Grandfather James was safe to love? Margaret smiled at the memory of meeting her future husband. James had his own demons from the war in the Pacific. I think recognizing pain in each other helped us understand that healing was possible. We built trust slowly, day by day, choice by choice. After 2 hours in the museum, Colonel Hendricks suggested they move to her office to continue their conversation in private. Margaret felt surprisingly energized by the discussion, as though sharing her story in this context was lifting a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. Mrs. Chun, Colonel Hendricks said as they settled into comfortable chairs in her office, I want you to know that your story illustrates something crucial that many young people need to understand. You've shown that survival is not just about enduring terrible circumstances, but about choosing to build something meaningful from the experience of having endured them. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. I've always believed that survival is only meaningful if it leads to a life worth living. I didn't survive just to exist. I survived to love, to create, to contribute. That's exactly the message that could make a difference to our Marines, Colonel Hendricks said. Many of them come from backgrounds of trauma, poverty, or violence. They need to see that their past doesn't have to define their future. Margaret felt something click into place in her thinking. She had always focused on the ways that sharing her story might be painful or intrusive, but she hadn't fully considered how it might actually be healing for both herself and her audience. What would it look like if I decided to speak to some Marines? She asked. Colonel Hendricks leaned forward with interest. We could start very small, maybe just a group of 20 or 30 Marines who volunteer to attend. You could tell as much or as little of your story as you're comfortable with. You would have complete control over the format and the content. Michael spoke up from his chair beside Margaret. I think some of my unit would be really interested in hearing from you, grandmother. We've been talking about resilience and mental toughness in our training, and your experience represents the ultimate example of both. Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness at the idea, but also something that might have been excitement. After decades of keeping her story private, the prospect of sharing it with people who could benefit from it felt like a way to give her survival additional meaning. "Could I think about it for a little while longer?" she asked. "Of course," Colonel Hendricks replied. "This is entirely your decision, and you should only do it if it feels right to you." As they prepared to leave the base, Margaret felt different than she had when they arrived. The conversation had helped her understand that sharing her story didn't have to mean losing control over it. She could choose how much to reveal, to whom, and under what circumstances. During the drive back to San Francisco, Michael was unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke up. "Grandmother, I'm starting to understand why you kept your past private for so long. It's heavy stuff to carry around." Margaret glanced at her grandson, seeing a new maturity in his expression. "It is heavy, but I've learned that carrying it alone is much harder than carrying it with people who care about you. Do you think you're going to speak to the Marines?" Margaret was quiet for several miles as she considered the question. Finally, she spoke. "I think I might. Not because I think I have to, but because I think I want to. There's a difference between being forced to relive trauma and choosing to share wisdom that came from surviving it." 2 months later, Margaret found herself standing in front of 30 Marines at Parris Island, telling her story to an audience for the first time in her life. She had decided to focus on the lessons rather than the details, talking about determination, the importance of community, and the choice to build meaning from suffering. The Marines listened with an intensity that surprised her. They asked thoughtful questions about mental resilience, about finding purpose in difficult circumstances, and about the difference between surviving and thriving. Many of them shared their own stories of overcoming challenges, creating a dialogue that felt more like a conversation between people with shared experiences than a lecture from teacher to students. Commander Sullivan, who was observing the session, approached Margaret afterward with obvious emotion. "Mrs. Chun, that was extraordinary. You've given these Marines something valuable, proof that human beings can endure unimaginable things and still create lives of meaning and joy." Margaret felt a deep satisfaction as she looked at the faces of the young Marines around her. She could see that her story had touched them, not because it was tragic, but because it was ultimately hopeful. She had survived to become someone's grandmother, to help raise a young man who was now serving his country, to contribute to the continuing story of human resilience. "Commander," she said, "I think I'd like to do this again sometime." As she and Michael prepared to leave Parris Island after her first speaking engagement, Margaret realized that her reluctance to share her story had been based on a misunderstanding. She had thought that talking about her past would define her as a victim, but instead, it had allowed her to define herself as a survivor who had chosen to transform her pain into wisdom. The tattoo on her arm would always be there, a permanent reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty. But now it also represented something else: the refusal to be destroyed, the determination to build meaning from suffering, and the choice to use her survival to help others find their own strength. "Thank you for encouraging me to do this," she told Michael as they drove away from the base. "Thank you for trusting me with your story," he replied. "And thank you for showing me what real courage looks like." Margaret smiled as she watched the South Carolina landscape pass by her window. She had come to Parris Island 6 months ago, simply wanting to see her grandson graduate. She was leaving as someone who had rediscovered the power of her own survival story and the value of sharing it with others who needed to understand that the human spirit could not be easily broken. The business cards were no longer sitting on her kitchen table. They were in her purse, along with a schedule of future speaking engagements and a folder of letters from Marines who had been moved by her story. Margaret Chun had become exactly what she had never wanted to be: a Holocaust educator and public speaker. But somehow, in choosing it for herself rather than having it forced upon her, she had found that it was exactly what she was meant to become. Her survival had always been meaningful, but now it had purpose beyond her personal happiness. She was living proof that terrible experiences didn't have to create terrible people, that strength could grow from suffering, and that the choice to build a life of love and contribution was always available, no matter what circumstances had come before. Margaret had arrived at Paris Island to celebrate her grandson's beginning as a Marine. She was leaving with her own new beginning as someone who had finally learned to see her survival not as a burden to be hidden, but as a gift to be shared with the world.